Hey guys, Tyler Ansman here with Tyler Ansman Performance. So today what we're going to discuss is return to throw programs, the good, the bad, the in-between. I think kind of the first important piece is a little background. All right, so one of the really popular topics right now with players, coaches, parents, etc., is kind of injury rates in baseball. All right, and I think one of the things that we're seeing is this is going to come even more to the forefront than it already is because of stars missing time. Right, we've seen Spencer Strider, Shohei Ohtani, Jacob deGrom, Verlander, Scherzer. All of these guys are missing time now. So when we have stars not on the field, this becomes a problem, for everybody. And so I think there's a couple of reasons we're seeing injury rates go up over the past few decades. One is kind of clinicians and diagnostic tools as a whole are getting better at diagnosing injuries. So that's one, right? Probably a lot of guys went undiagnosed in the past, or maybe careers just ended, right? You kind of saw this when Tommy John surgery first started. Before that, careers just ended or guys just kind of dealt with it. Outputs weren't high enough for it to matter. The second piece is exactly that, right? We're seeing outputs go up kind of to crazy peaks. So what we're seeing is Major League Baseball, the average fastball velocity now is 94.2 miles an hour, or was in 2024. That's up 3 miles an hour over the last 15 years. Doesn't sound like a lot, but we're talking about massive differences from years and years ago. The other piece is we're seeing kind of greater frequency of pitching, especially for relievers, and we're seeing more games in a season than we've ever seen before. We're asking guys to throw, if they're a starter, 200 innings a year. We're playing every single day. There's a lot of travel. Every fifth day they're starting. Is that really enough rest? Relievers, we're pitching 2 days in a row, sometimes 3 days in a row, or a day in between, all of these kinds of things. And we know from the research on kind of fatigue and all of these other pieces that not only does range of motion change and generally not come back for somewhere between 48 and 72 hours, but we're talking about the same with kind of these strength measures. So what would we look at? We'd look at kind of grip strength. We would look at elbow extension and flexion strength. We would look at internal and external rotation strength. And so when we see these things not coming back, we kind of have this recipe for disaster where the active restraints, right? So we want to talk about kind of muscle tissue, can't take over for the passive restraints, the ligaments, tendons, the fascia, in the same way that it can when it's not fatigued. So we have kind of these problems. So now we get to kind of return to throw programs, okay? And so what's the issue here? Well, I think one of the things is they haven't been updated in quite a long time. So there's kind of this standard template that you're gonna get when you get cleared from physical therapy, or when you're starting to get cleared, you can start throwing again. And what it's gonna look like is essentially we're gonna take 10, 20 throws at 45 feet. Then we're gonna go 10, 20 throws at 60 feet, so on and so forth. How much sense does this really make when we know you can throw 90 miles an hour from 45 feet, or you can throw 60 miles an hour from 45 feet? And then if we kind of think about this from an individualization standpoint, what does this look like with the guys who throw 102 versus the guys who throw 82? How much sense does it make that we have the same requirements for both of those guys? So that's one piece. The second piece is kind of exactly that piece we initially hit on, where we're not adequately accounting for that intensity, right? We can throw 90 or 60 from 45 feet. So intensity is kind of one of the three main factors, right, along with volume and frequency, when we're talking about throwing load, okay? And so if we're not properly accounting for one of these three really important factors, we're not adequately accounting for throwing load. And we know from Tim Gavitt's research that if we're increasing throwing load by more than kind of 30%, whether it's session to session, week to week, however we're kind of dealing with these timelines on an acute to chronic basis, we have a risk for injury that's going up dramatically. We get over that 50% mark, injury goes up by kind of generally 2 times. So we're dealing with kind of all of these pieces where we're not adequately accounting for this kind of intensity measure. So that's one thing. Kind of the next piece is we're generally not seeing a lot of mechanical or kind of patterning change happening. We're just trying to kind of get these guys throwing again. We're going to get them back to the mound, and we're going to get them back in the game. Where we likely need to make some type of change, because while throwing load is the most important factor that likely led them here, we probably have some other kind of confounding issues from a patterning and mechanical standpoint that need to be addressed, where we're either going to take performance beyond where it was before, which generally everybody wants. We're going to take health beyond where it was before, and kind of this resiliency or robustness aspect beyond where it was before. That's kind of the next piece for this, all right? I think one of the other issues is we're dealing with kind of baseballs from the get-go, rather than thinking about throwing some, kind of different implements, okay? So these would all be kind of some of the things that I would think about that make, kind of the general return to throw programs problematic. So what makes our return to throw programs different? So I think one of the things that we're talking about is that kind of that exact last piece that I hit on. We're not necessarily going to throw baseballs right from the beginning. Okay, so pain is multifactorial and pretty complex and not always super well understood. And so when we're throwing baseballs from the beginning, and this is what got guys hurt in the first place, we're going to have some kind of psychological, whether it's subconscious or not, they may have some bias towards kind of believing that the baseball is going to be painful. Okay, so we may want to go towards some other type of implement, whether it's plyo balls where we're not feeling the seams, whether it's a softball, still pretty close to a baseball, but very different mass, or a football, where we can get kind of some healthy and pain-free throwing sessions, begin stacking these pain-free days, and then eventually we go back to throwing a baseball in a more specific context, but we start a bit more general with that. So I think that's one piece. So the other benefit we have from these overload balls, whether it's kind of the overload plyo balls or the football or the softball, whatever it is that this movement is happening slower, right? Because this mass is greater, this load is greater, okay? And so what that does is it allows more cross bridges to form. So we're getting this greater kind of muscular action happening. So there's less load on the passive restraints, which are likely the thing that we're kind of recovering from is some kind of strain or surgery or whatever to that piece. So by having kind of greater muscular activation, we also kind of get the benefit of a little bit less load as we're coming back to this because that connective tissue is going to adapt relatively slowly compared to the muscle tissue. And then even before that, depending on kind of what the physical therapy background has looked like, we may need to even kind of pull it back one more layer and go to kind of a general plyometric kind of program first before we even get to throwing, right? To be a bit more specific with plyometrics in the upper body to kind of adequately prepare the tissue and the central nervous system for what's about to happen. So that's one piece. The second piece is kind of that intensity measure. We're going to measure all of these throws on the radar gun based on what their previous peak velocity was. Okay, and so we're going to give them percentages of this, and we're going to have a cap on a given day of what that looks like in terms of number of throws, velocity, all of these things. So we're pretty precisely accounting for that throwing load. All right, the other thing that we're going to look at are these kind of timelines between days. Okay, so what does it look like in terms of rest day to day? What we're looking at is generally 48 to 72 hours between throwing sessions, so these kind of strength measures and range of motion measures can come back. We're making sure that guys aren't having pain, and then we can kind of progress it from there. If they're having pain, we're going to pull it back a little bit. So that's one piece. That third piece is these kind of mechanical interventions that we talked about. So when guys come in, what we're going to do is we're going to have kind of an assessment process, okay? So we're going to assess range of motion, we're going to test strength and power, and we're going to likely look at historical video because they're probably not going to be healthy enough to do a live throwing assessment, okay? And so all of these things are going to allow us to say, okay, what changes do we need to make and how are we going to go about this? So that will be integrated into the throwing process as well. We're likely going to have these kind of constraints as part of it, not just immediately kind of back to the mound or step behinds or this full throwing pattern. We're going to chunk it a bit more than that, okay? So I think that's kind of, those are going to be some really important differences that we're going to see with kind of our return to throw and other return to throw programs, all right? And so kind of what does it look like, just kind of to recap, functionally. So we're going to start with the assessment process. We're going to test, right, mobility. We're going to test strength measures, some velocity and power measures. We're going to get previous velocity baselines for these guys, and we're going to get historical video for that. That's going to allow us to kind of put together the program. We're going to give them kind of guardrails, these constraints, and these other throwing implements that we're going to use before baseballs. All right, and we're going to give them intensity measures so we know exactly how much throwing load we're getting day to day. All right, and then gradually we're going to build this before getting back to the full pattern. All right, so that's just kind of how we do return to throw a little bit differently. If you're interested in learning more about it, feel free to kind of drop us an email or a message below. Otherwise, thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.